just a strip mall nurse. That's what Thomas Kellerman had called her at the vending machines 3 weeks ago, his voice carrying through the break room like a blade. That's the kind of credential you pick up between shifts at Walmart. The other parks department staff had frozen mid-chew, their eyes darting between the park's operations director and the quiet woman in the medical station polo, waiting to see if she would flinch. She didn't. She never did. They didn't know that Elena Martinez had performed a field thoracotomy with a combat knife while mortar rounds cratered the street in Ramadi. They didn't know she'd held a soldier's ribcage open with her bare hands while his blood ran warm across her surgical gloves, his heartbeat returning under her fingers like a prayer being answered. They didn't know she was Captain Elena Martinez, 8 months into a classified military intelligence assignment monitoring suspected smuggling operations through the Denver Parks Department vendor contracts, assigned to a medical station beside Washington Park while the real investigation unfolded behind closed doors. The truth was simpler than their gossip. And far more dangerous. The morning sun hit the parking lot in waves of heat that made the asphalt shimmer like water. Elena arrived at the Cedar Creek Medical Mobile Station, a white trailer with a red cross painted on the side, at 7:56 a.m., 17 minutes before her shift began. Precision was habit. The station sat nestled between the north entrance of Washington Park and the walking trails, positioned perfectly to monitor foot traffic from the vendor area where 3 separate smuggling routes intersected. She had charted them all in encrypted reports that went nowhere anyone at the Parks Department would ever see. Her supervisor at the Pentagon knew. Her handler knew. Thomas Kellerman knew nothing, and that was exactly how it needed to stay. The medical station smelled like antiseptic and rubber gloves, a scent she'd known for 8 years, first as a combat medic with the 75th Ranger Regiment, then as a registered nurse at Cedar Creek Medical's Trauma Bay, and now here, arranging bandages in careful rows while pretending to be nobody important. She pulled open the supply cabinet and began her inventory: trauma shears, blood pressure cuffs, pulse oximeters, a defibrillator that hadn't been used in 6 weeks. The cabinet's metal hinges creaked as she closed it. The sound carried the weight of routine, the mundane rhythm of someone just passing through. She opened the bottom drawer of her desk with her left hand, the hand with surgical scars along the knuckles, thin white lines that caught the light when she wasn't careful. Retractor marks. She'd held those marks for 3 years without telling anyone what they meant. The folded triangle of fabric lay exactly where she'd placed it that morning, the flag from Captain Michael Reeves's casket, pressed into thirds with the precision of military tradition. Reeves had been her team medic. He'd also been the reason she'd volunteered for this assignment 8 months ago, digging through paperwork that the Army had officially closed, following threads of investigation that led to Denver, to vendor contracts, to a parks operations director named Thomas Kellerman who'd been skimming medical supply bids for 18 months and paying off his debts with information that moved across borders in unmarked containers. She let her finger rest on the folded flag for exactly 2 seconds, then closed the drawer and locked it. Emotion was data. She catalogued it and moved forward. The first visitor arrived at 8:34 a.m. Jogging paths converged near the medical station, and this time it was 3 teenagers running laps around the park's perimeter, laughing hard about something Elena didn't need to hear. She was checking the oxygen tanks, all for full, gauges showing green, when the joggers moved past, their voices fading into the distance. The park breathed around her, birds calling in the elm trees, the distant sound of sprinklers stuttering on, the low hum of traffic from Evans Avenue where the vendor area sprawled across asphalt in the shadow of downtown. At 9:12 a.m., her phone buzzed once. A text message from an encrypted app, Reeves file updated. Check your handler portal. She deleted the message immediately and continued her work. The Park Services station was small enough that anyone could watch her movements, the Parks Department staff who came through, the maintenance crews, the occasional vendor checking on his booth. Thomas Kellerman most of all. He had eyes everywhere because he'd learned early that the people easiest to control were the ones who didn't know they were being watched. The morning stretched long and quiet. Elena restocked the first aid kits that lined the trail, small red boxes bolted to trees every quarter mile, with bandages, antiseptic wipes, and pain relievers. Her movements were economical, each step purposeful, her hands moving with the steady precision of someone who'd learned that hesitation killed people. She'd learned that lesson the hard way, in a concrete aid station in Ramadi with artillery thumping the walls and a 19-year-old Marine whose femoral artery had been severed by shrapnel. She'd held pressure for 14 minutes while waiting for evacuation. He lived. The memory lived too, waiting in the spaces between her heartbeats. By 10:08 a.m., the heat had climbed to 93 degrees. Elena sat in the station's small office area, really just a folding desk and a chair in the corner, reviewing the Parks Department's internal medical compliance logs. This was her cover work, the reason her paychecks deposited every other Friday, the reason Thomas Kellerman had hired her without question when she'd applied with credentials that were completely real and a background that was completely false. The logs were tedious: incident reports from trail injuries, heat exhaustion cases, one possible dehydration event near the boating lake in July. Nothing remarkable. Nothing that connected to the investigation. That was intentional. The real work happened in the vendor area, where medical supplies moved through distribution channels that were supposed to terminate at hospitals and clinics but sometimes kept moving east toward the border. The door chimed, a soft electronic beep that made Elena's head lift an inch. Thomas Kellerman stood in the doorway with a folder clutched against his chest like a trophy he'd already won. He was tall, built soft in the way that came from desk work and expensive lunches, and he smiled in a way that never reached his eyes. His suit was pressed too hard, the creases cutting his shoulders into sharp angles. Everything about him broadcast wealth and political connection, the kind of man who'd learned that people had prices and that the Parks Department was small enough to control if you had the right leverage. "Martinez," he said, stepping inside without waiting for an invitation. "Just the person I needed to see." Elena rose from her desk, her posture shifting into the exact shape of deference that had taken her 3 weeks to perfect. Shoulders slightly bowed. Eye contact minimal. The voice that came out was softer than her real voice, the kind of tone that made people forget to pay attention to the woman underneath. "Good morning, Mr. Kellerman. How can I help?" He laid the folder on her desk with ceremony, as if he'd arranged something important. Inside were vendor contracts, specifications for a medical supply company called Heritage Health Distribution. She recognized the name immediately. It belonged to Kellerman's brother-in-law, Marcus Thorne, a man with 3 pending fraud investigations and a warehouse in northeast Denver that was supposed to contain first aid kits and hospital-grade equipment but actually contained other things. Things that moved at night. Things that had gotten Captain Michael Reeves killed in Ramadi because someone had sold weapons-grade components to people who wanted Americans dead. "My brother-in-law's company," Kellerman said, sliding the bid sheet toward her. "Very competitive pricing. They want to be the primary supplier for all Denver Parks Department medical stations. I need your sign-off as the medical director." Elena's eyes moved across the numbers without flinching, without the slightest tremor in her expression. The prices were inflated 32% above market rate. The equipment specifications listed were below hospital grade: bandages that wouldn't pass CDC certification, gauze that wasn't sterile sealed, blood pressure cuffs with calibration tolerances outside acceptable ranges. Every line item was designed to move cheap goods through a legitimate government channel so they could be repackaged and distributed to buyers who didn't ask questions about sourcing. "I can't approve this," Elena said quietly. Her voice was steady as a pulse monitor showing normal sinus rhythm. "The specifications don't meet Colorado Department of Public Health standards. The pricing is non-competitive." Kellerman's smile never wavered. It was the smile of someone who'd learned that rejection was just negotiation wearing a different costume. "You're new here, Martinez. You're going to learn how things work in Denver. How people help each other. How we build relationships." He tapped the folder with one manicured finger. The sound was soft but deliberate. "Think about it. Talk to me when you've come to your senses." He turned and walked out without waiting for a response, his shoes clicking against the trailer's metal floor, the sound harsh as gunfire in the sudden quiet. Elena didn't move. She let the silence settle into the space where his presence had been, let her hands rest flat on the desk, let her breathing remain exactly as it had been before he arrived. The only thing that changed was her eyes. They went the color of something very old and very dangerous, something that had learned to hunt in places where hesitation was a form of suicide. When she moved, it was to open the bottom drawer of her desk again. She lifted the folded flag with both hands, careful not to let it touch anything else, and held it for the space of 4 heartbeats. Reeves's flag. Reeves's case. Reeves's brother-in-law sitting in a northeast warehouse counting money that came from weapons sales to the same people who turned a corner in Ramadi into a cemetery. She placed the flag back in the drawer and closed it with absolute gentleness, as if it might break. Then she pulled her secure phone from her pocket and typed a message that went to a Pentagon account and a classified intelligence channel. Target refused initial cooperation on illicit vendor contract. Proceeding to Phase 2 monitoring. Increased security protocols recommended. The response came back in 14 seconds. Understood. Stay in position. Do not engage. Elena placed the phone away and returned to her desk, where the forms and logs waited for her attention. The morning light had turned harsh and golden, the kind of light that showed every dust particle in the air, the kind that left no room for shadows. Outside, Washington Park breathed its summer heat and its secrets, and somewhere in that park, joggers were running their afternoon laps, unaware that the quiet woman in the medical station beside the trails was the most dangerous person within 5 miles. But that wasn't the worst part. The worst part was that Thomas Kellerman had just started something he had no idea how to stop. The City Council park inspection happened on a Tuesday morning when the October sun made Washington Park look like a postcard nobody would believe. 15 officials stood in a semicircle around Thomas Kellerman as he knelt beside a CPR training mannequin, his voice carrying the false authority of someone who'd watched a YouTube video once. Elena stood in the back row, her medical bag at her side, her face a granite mask. Tourniquet application is critical, Kellerman announced, his fingers fumbling with the rubber training strap. He positioned it high on the mannequin's thigh, for inches above where an actual wound would demand placement. The twist stick hung loose, unsecured, the pressure uneven. This is the correct technique. Arterial bleeding stops here. He said it like he'd written the textbooks. The council members nodded, scribbling notes. One of them smiled at him. Elena's jaw tightened, but she didn't move. She'd spent 8 months watching this. 8 months filing reports that disappeared into Kellerman's desk drawer, never read, never acted on. 8 months of just a nurse comments at the vending machines, of being introduced to visiting contractors as our new medical support staff with some basic first aid training, of watching him rewrite protocols in ways that violated basic safety standards. But the tourniquet demonstration, that crossed a line that lived in Elena's muscle memory. That placement would cause permanent nerve damage, Elena said quietly. Her voice didn't climb. It didn't shake. It dropped like a stone into still water. The tourniquet needs to be 2 inches above the wound, and the twist stick requires tension to prevent migration. The council members turned. Kellerman's face flushed, a storm rising behind his eyes. He stood slowly, and when he turned toward her, the smile he wore had teeth in it. I don't recall asking for input from support staff, he said. His voice stayed level, but Elena heard the calculation underneath, the decision forming in real time to make this moment count. He turned to the 2 security officers standing near the pavilion entrance. They were young, probably private contract, probably paid barely enough to care about the details of what they were told. Officers, this is a closed inspection. Martinez, you're not authorized to be here. Please escort her out. It wasn't a request. It was a command delivered through subordinates. Humiliation as policy. Elena met Kellerman's stare for exactly 3 seconds. Her hands didn't shake. Her breathing didn't change. In those 3 seconds, she made the calculation too, that walking out without argument was the smarter play than standing her ground. Composure was power, and she wasn't about to give him the satisfaction of seeing her refuse. She turned and walked ahead of the security officers while 15 officials watched. Her back stayed straight. The rubber soles of her medical sneakers made quiet sounds against the concrete path. Behind her, she heard Kellerman explaining something to the council members, his voice already reframing the narrative into something flattering to himself. That was how it always worked. You corrected him, and somehow you became the problem. 2 weeks earlier, the The staff meeting had been worse in the way that public betrayals always are, delivered with an audience, recorded in memory, impossible to unsee. The community center conference room smelled like industrial carpet and the ghost of 1,000 morning meetings. 23 Parks Department employees sat in folding chairs arranged in rows like a school assembly. Kellerman stood at the front with a presentation remote in his hand, his face the picture of administrative concern. The PowerPoint slide behind him read, Safety Protocols and Professional Standards. We need to discuss credential verification, Kellerman announced, clicking to the next slide. It showed a checklist, all items marked with red X's. I've discovered concerning gaps in our hiring process. It's a safety issue. Elena sat in the third row, hands folded in her lap. Around her, she felt the shift, the way a group turns its attention like a predator. She'd served with soldiers who'd been interrogated by experts. This wasn't interrogation. This was theater, and Kellerman was good at it. Some staff may have exaggerated their qualifications, he continued. The slide changed. Now it showed what looked like a medical certificate printed on cheap paper. Strip mall nursing certificates instead of real medical training. Someone could get hurt because we didn't verify credentials properly. Laughter rippled through the room. Elena didn't flinch. Her breathing remained steady, in through the nose, out through the mouth, a rhythm she'd learned in places where controlling your breath meant controlling whether you survived. She opened her notepad and wrote, October 14th, 2:56 p.m., staff meeting, credential discussion. Her handwriting was neat. Neutral. The handwriting of someone taking minutes, not someone being executed. I'm developing new verification requirements, Kellerman said. His eyes still didn't find her directly, but everyone else's did. She felt the weight of 23 gazes like a physical pressure. We can't have people playing doctor with first aid patches from weekend courses. This is a parks department, not a trauma center. We need standards. More laughter. Nervous laughter. The kind that came from people who weren't quite sure if this was still professional but were too uncomfortable to challenge it. Elena kept writing. Pain was information. Humiliation was data. The stronger the signal, the more she needed to document it. The break room attack came 3 days later. She'd been selecting a protein bar from the vending machine when Kellerman arrived with 2 parks maintenance supervisors, men Elena recognized from the grounds crew, both of them wearing the look of people who'd been invited to something exclusive. The break room was crowded. 8 people. A perfect audience. Well, Kellerman said loudly, his voice carrying across the tile floor with the precision of a stage actor hitting his mark. Nurse Martinez. Or should I say EMT Martinez? He pronounced it like a slur. Or is it Community College Martinez? The supervisors laughed. One of them elbowed the other. Elena's hand steadied on the vending machine button. She retrieved her protein bar slowly, methodically, as if she hadn't heard any of it. Tell me, Kellerman continued, did your certification come with a free oil change? Elena turned. She met his eyes, flat, empty of emotion, the gaze of someone who'd learned to see people as problems to solve rather than threats to fear. In that gaze, she saw something flicker across his face. Uncertainty. For just a moment, he wasn't sure if he'd broken her or if she'd broken him. Then Elena walked past him without speaking. Behind her, she heard someone whisper, I heard she lied on her resume. Another voice, my sister's a nurse. Real nurses don't take park jobs. In the hallway, Elena's hands were completely still. Her heart rate had climbed maybe 10 beats per minute. Her breathing was perfect. But that night, when she sat on the floor of her apartment with the triangle-folded flag in her lap, the flag that had draped the casket of her team medic, the friend she'd held in her arms in Ramadi while his blood ran across her scrubs, that night, the trembling started. Her hands shook as they held the flag. Not from fear. From restraint. From the accumulated weight of smiling and nodding and filing reports that disappeared, of being dismissed and mocked and publicly executed one comment at a time, of watching a man who'd never saved a life in his life rewrite the rules that governed hers. The trembling wasn't weakness. It was the sound a wire makes just before it snaps. But Kellerman wasn't finished. He'd started something that required completion, and over the following 2 weeks, Elena discovered the architecture of his campaign. It wasn't random cruelty. It was strategic. It was calculated. And it was all connected to one decision she'd made 8 months ago, the decision to refuse his request. She'd learned about the medical supply contract during her 3rd week at the parks department. A routine vendor review had revealed inflated pricing on Clara Medical Solutions, a company owned by Kellerman's brother-in-law, Marcus Chen. The contract was for routine supplies, bandages, ice packs, antiseptic wipes, things that should have cost perhaps 40% less than what Clara Medical was charging. Elena had documented the discrepancy in her initial report to Kellerman's supervisor. She'd been professional. She'd been thorough. And she'd been ignored. 2 weeks later, Kellerman had called her into his office. The Clara Medical contract, he'd said, his fingers steepled on his desk. I need you to sign off on it. Your department's approval is the final step. Elena had said no. One word. Professional. No. His face had gone very still. You understand this is a standard vendor relationship. My brother-in-law provides competitive pricing on quality products. We need to support local businesses. The pricing is 38% above market rate, Elena had said. She'd had the documentation open on her laptop. For identical products from certified suppliers in the same region. I can't approve this in good conscience. Kellerman's smile had appeared then, the same smile she'd seen during the council inspection, the one with teeth in it. I'll address this with my supervisor, he'd said, which was code for, I'm going to make you regret this. And he had. Oh, he had. The public attacks, the mocking, the systematic destruction of her reputation among the staff, all of it tracked back to that single refusal. Elena had filed that intelligence report to Collins too, the handler who checked on her weekly. His retaliating because of the contract I refused to approve, Elena had said, her voice steady. His brother-in-law's medical supply company. Collins had nodded, unsurprised. We know. We've been watching Clara Medical Solutions for 4 months. The company is being used to launder cash from the smuggling operation. Kellerman's brother-in-law isn't just getting rich off inflated contracts. He's moving product through the vendor network. That had been the moment Elena understood she wasn't being humiliated because she'd embarrassed a petty administrator. She was being humiliated because she'd threatened a criminal enterprise, and Kellerman was doing his job, neutralizing the threat by making her radioactive, by making sure nobody trusted her, by creating a paper trail that suggested she was incompetent. He was good at it. Which made him dangerous. Which was why Elena kept showing up, kept filing her reports, kept moving through the parks department with the calm of someone who'd been trained by people who understood that the quietest warriors were often the most lethal. The city council inspection had been his mistake. He'd gotten confident. He'd started believing his own narrative about her being unqualified. And he'd been wrong about one thing, Elena hadn't been correcting him from a place of ego or frustration. She'd been correcting him from muscle memory, from 3 years of field medicine, from the weight of keeping soldiers alive. She'd been correcting him from a place of truth. What happened next would change everything, though neither of them knew it yet. The video hit viral status at 2:13 a.m. on a Tuesday. Elena didn't sleep, she watched it spread across her phone like contagion. Park nurse saves decorated colonel, but who is she really? The angle was tight, just her hands performing compressions, just her voice counting compressions with the precision of someone who'd done this before. Not in a park. Somewhere louder. Somewhere with explosions. By dawn, her phone was flooded. Names she hadn't heard in 8 years. Master Sergeant Halloway from the 160th SAW. Captain James Chen from the 75th Ranger Regiment. Sergeant First Class Marcus Webb from her old unit in Ramadi. They'd found the video. They recognized the hands. They recognized the muscle memory that moved like water, like someone who'd performed thoracotomies with a combat knife under fire while insurgents tried to kill her through a tin roof. The messages were careful. Interested. Is this you, /Elena, /call me. None of them said what they meant. We know you're alive. We know you're somewhere. We're ready to talk about what you did over there. Elena deleted each message as it arrived. Her phone rang at 11 p.m. Thursday. Unknown number. She answered anyway, muscle memory of a different kind. Captain Martinez. Not a question. The voice was thin, precise, the kind of voice that belonged to people who worked in rooms with no windows. This is Handler Collins. We need to meet. Colfax Avenue Coffee Shop. Tuesday morning. Collins arrived exactly on time, a man in his 50s with grey at the temples and the posture of someone who'd spent 40 years pretending to be ordinary while orchestrating things most people never knew existed. He ordered black coffee and sat across from her at a corner table while rain hammered the windows like accusations. Your operational status is deteriorating, Collins said without preamble. The Green Beret Colonel, his name is James. Commanding officer for the 7th Battalion. He has a clearance level that allows him to cross-reference databases most people don't know exist. He's already contacted 2 federal agencies asking about a Captain Elena Martinez who performed battlefield medicine in Ramadi. The video is being analyzed. Not just by civilians, by the Pentagon. By JSOC analysts who catalog military medical personnel. Elena sipped her coffee. The cup was chipped at the rim. She'd noticed that immediately, the kind of detail that mattered when you'd spent years noticing which details meant survival. Your cover identity is still intact, Collins continued. Park Services nurse, no military background, Denver resident for 14 months. But the timeline is accelerating. The smuggling investigation you've been conducting, the medical supply contracts, the vendor network, we've identified the kingpin. A cartel liaison operating out of commerce. He's moving product next week. Wednesday. Through the Saturday farmers market where your medical station operates. The vendor who receives the shipment is the same man who collapsed in front of you 2 weeks ago. Mohammed al-Hamdani. Former insurgent, flipped to us 6 years ago, been embedded in the supply chain since. He's the conduit. You're the only operational asset positioned to confirm his identity and document the transfer. Elena set her coffee down. What are you saying? I'm saying the investigation just became more important than your cover. You have 6 days to document the exchange. Then we extract you. The extraction is already being arranged. A quiet termination of your Park Services contract. You disappear. New identity, new city, new start. But first, you work the Saturday market. You're present during the transfer. You confirm al-Hamdani receives the shipment. You document everything. The rain intensified. A siren wailed past on Colfax, red lights bleeding through the window like blood in water. Kellerman knows something's wrong, Collins said. He's been making calls. The brother-in-law's medical supply company, it's connected to the cartel network. Kellerman is either knowingly involved or catastrophically stupid. Either way, he's becoming hostile. 2 days ago he submitted a complaint to the Denver Parks Commissioner questioning your credentials. He's moving toward termination. Before Saturday. Elena's hands were steady. Her voice was steady. Everything about her suggested a woman who'd just been told her cover was compromised and she had 6 days left of a life she never wanted. What she actually was thinking, 6 days. Al-Hamdani receives the shipment. I document it. Then I disappear. Then I never have to see Thomas Kellerman again. Then I never have to kneel beside another body and watch a man's eyes open and see rank in my face that I spent months burying. I understand, Elena said. Collins slid a sealed envelope across the table. Coordinates. Time. Documentation protocol. Al-Hamdani will wear a red baseball cap. When he receives the shipment, you take a photograph. You don't interact. You don't make eye contact. You work the medical station and you document. That's all. He stood, leaving cash on the table for both coffees. "Captain Martinez," he said as he moved toward the door. "The colonel, the one who recognized you in the park. James Reeves. His son was assigned to your unit in Ramadi. You saved that child's life when a mortar round took out a Humvee. That's why he called you by rank. Muscle memory of a different kind. He'll keep digging. So will JSOC. You have 6 days. After that, Captain Elena Martinez stops existing." The door closed behind him. Rain hammered the window. Elena opened the envelope. Coordinates: 39.7392 degrees north, 104.9903 degrees west. That was Washington Park. Time: 10:48 a.m. Documentation protocol: photograph, flash disabled, confirm visual identification and exchange. She placed the envelope inside her jacket, over her heart. Over the folded flag she'd carried for 8 years. The flag from her team medic, the one who died in Ramadi while Elena was 20 feet away in a firefight. The one she'd wrapped around his body. The one the honor guard had given her after the service, pressed into her hands like a secret. Saturday morning arrived clear and bright, the kind of Denver sky that made you forget how much could break underneath it. The farmers' market sprawled across the north lawn of Washington Park, vendors with vegetables and honey, craft beer stands, face painters for children. Elena worked the medical station, a small tent with a table and supplies, surrounded by the casual machinery of weekend life. By 10:14 a.m., she hadn't seen anyone in a red baseball cap. At 10:15 a.m., she heard the sound. Sharp. Precise. The sound of a small-caliber discharge from a concealed weapon. Not a gunshot in the traditional sense, a weapon discharging inside fabric, inside flesh, muffled by body and clothing. The sound of something going catastrophically wrong inside someone's chest. Then screaming. Elena was moving before her mind caught up. She moved like someone who'd run toward explosions professionally, like someone for whom running toward danger was muscle memory encoded in bone. The medical station evaporated from her consciousness. Mohammed Al-Hamdani lay on the grass 15 feet from the medical supply vendors, clutching his left chest, blood spreading across his shirt in a pattern that told her everything: penetrating wound, left side, pneumothorax, maybe hemothorax, maybe cardiac tamponade if the round went deep enough. His breathing was rapid and shallow, his lips already turning blue at the edges. Elena dropped beside him, ripping open his shirt. The entry wound was small, precise, the kind of wound that came from a weapon discharged at close range inside a jacket. His chest was pale. His ribs moved irregularly. Left side silent when she pressed her ear to his chest, no breath sounds. Right side wheeze and crackle. "Someone hold his shoulders," she ordered. 2 market workers moved without question, pressing his shoulders against the ground. Thomas Kellerman arrived, his face red, his voice loud. "Do not let her touch him. Wait for paramedics. Elena, step back. Now." Elena didn't acknowledge him. She ran her fingers across Al-Hamdani's ribs, counting, finding the landmarks. 4th intercostal space. Midclavicular line. She pulled her pocket knife from her medical bag, the one she'd carried since Afghanistan, the blade worn smooth by use. She pulled a ballpoint pen from the table, hollowed out the barrel by jamming the ink tube through from the opposite end months ago. She prepared for this moment without knowing she was preparing. Kellerman grabbed her shoulder. His hand was hot. Slick with sweat. Elena shrugged him off without force, without acknowledging his existence. She positioned the hollow pen against the correct rib space and drove it forward with the heel of her hand. The resistance gave. The pen sank into the chest cavity. And then, the hiss. Air escaping. Pressure releasing. The pneumothorax decompressing like a held breath finally released. Al-Hamdani gasped. Color rushed back into his face. His breathing deepened. Oxygen saturation climbing. His eyes focused, meeting hers, and for a moment they recognized each other in a way that had nothing to do with the park or the farmer's market or the Saturday morning crowd now screaming and filming. "You know," Elena thought distantly. "You know what I am. You know what I did over there." The paramedics arrived at 10:22 a.m. They loaded Al-Hamdani onto the stretcher with efficiency, not even commenting on the hollowed pen still in his chest. By 10:35 a.m., he was gone. By 11:22 a.m., the market had resumed operation, tourists and families returning to vegetables and honey like nothing had happened. Elena was still standing at the medical station when Kellerman made his phone calls. She watched him walk toward the parking lot, phone pressed to his ear, his voice too low to hear but his body language unmistakable. She watched him walk back, his face still red, and she watched him point at her and mouth something to a security officer. By 6 p.m., her phone had 3 messages. First from HR, concerning a report filed with the Denver Parks Commissioner regarding unauthorized medical procedures and potential liability exposure. Second from the police liaison, "We're investigating a weapons discharge at the farmer's market. We'll need your statement." Third from Collins, "Mission compromised. You're being extracted. Termination effective immediately. You have 24 hours to clear your apartment. New documentation will arrive by courier." Elena deleted the first 2 messages. She read Collins's message 3 times. The folded flag was on her bed when she got home. She pressed her forehead against it like it could tell her something. Like it could explain why she'd saved the life of a man who was supposed to be a criminal. Why she'd moved to save Al-Hamdani with the same precision she'd moved to save the colonel in the park. Why muscle memory didn't distinguish between criminal and ally, between mission and humanity. Outside her apartment window, Denver glittered in the Saturday evening dark. Millions of lights, millions of people, millions of secrets. Somewhere in the city, Thomas Kellerman was making more phone calls. Somewhere, the Pentagon was analyzing the video from the park. Somewhere, her handler was arranging her extraction like she was nothing more than an asset being moved off the board. But that wasn't the worst part. The Saturday farmers' market sprawled across the south lawn of Washington Park like a patchwork quilt, vendor tents in yellow and white, the smell of fresh basil and diesel exhaust mixing in the morning air. Elena moved between the produce stands in her Parks Department uniform, her eyes tracking the vendor contacts she'd been assigned to monitor for 8 months. Karim al-Sharif stood at his booth selling imported spices, the same man she'd been watching since day 1 of her classified assignment. The same man nobody else knew was an intelligence asset. The shock came without warning. A pop like a car backfire, except it wasn't. Elena's body recognized the sound before her mind caught up, the distinctive crack of a concealed weapon discharging inside a civilian crowd. Vendor screaming. Children crying. The chaos that erupts when people realize someone just tried to kill someone else. Al-Sharif was down. Blood spreading across his white shirt, his chest wound tight and dark, the kind of wound that meant a pneumothorax was already collapsing his lung. Elena ran. Not toward the paramedics that hadn't arrived yet. Not toward the crowd that was screaming into their phones. Toward the man dying on the grass with his hand pressed to his ribs. Her supervisor's voice crackled through her radio. Thomas Kellerman, shouting from his office 3 blocks away, "Everyone stand back. Paramedics are 9 minutes out. Do not move the patient. Do not." Elena was already kneeling. Her hands moved on muscle memory, 8 months of watching Kellerman undermine her, mock her credentials, threaten her reputation, and she'd kept her composure, kept her voice level, kept her hand steady because she was trained for this. Not for staff meetings. For this. For the moment when everything else stopped mattering. She pulled a ballpoint pen from her pocket, a standard government-issue pen with a hollow tube, and used her trauma shears to cut away his shirt. Second intercostal space. Midclavicular line. That's where you go when a lung collapses and the patient has maybe 3 minutes before cardiac arrest becomes a terminal diagnosis. Kellerman's voice was still crackling through her radio, still ordering her to wait, and she was already breaking protocol because protocol didn't account for a man who was actively dying. The needle went in. Just the hollow tube from the pen barrel, no catheter, no fancy equipment, just the improvised solution that trauma surgeons use in war zones when they don't have supplies. The hiss of air escaping. That sound. That beautiful, terrible sound that meant the pneumothorax was releasing, meant the lung was reinflating, meant she'd won the race against biology by 90 seconds. Karim's breathing deepened. Color returned to his lips. Paramedics arrived and Elena stepped back, let the professionals take over, her hand still steady as they loaded him onto the stretcher. Her face showed nothing. Not exhaustion. Not relief. Not the fact that her 8-month undercover assignment had just become impossible to maintain because every person in the farmer's market had watched her perform a procedure that no Park Services nurse was trained to do. The next morning, her intelligence handler called. Special Agent Marcus Collins, voice tight and professional, your cover is compromised. The investigation is reassigned to another team as of now. 8 months. Gone. The progress she'd made documenting Kellerman's brother-in-law's smuggling operation through the park's vendor contracts, all of it reassigned because she'd saved a man's life and the world had watched her do it. But that wasn't the worst part. That was when Kellerman made his calls. The first call went to Dorothy Chen, the park's commissioner, a thin woman with a legal pad and a reputation for protecting the city from liability. The second call went to the police liaison, some captain who owed Kellerman favors. The third call went to the city HR director. Unauthorized medical procedures. Unpermitted weapons possession, the trauma shears technically qualified as a blade in a public space. Operating beyond her stated qualifications. Creating massive liability exposure. Each accusation was technically defensible. Each one was also a knife, and Kellerman knew exactly where to twist them because he'd spent 8 months learning everything about her, everything he could use. By Monday morning, Elena stood in his office. Kellerman sat behind his desk with its picture of him shaking hands with a city councilman. Dorothy Chen sat beside him with her legal pad, her expression carefully neutral, the kind of neutral that came from too many similar conversations. Miss Martinez, Chen began carefully, we have serious concerns about liability exposure. Elena's jaw didn't tighten. Her hands didn't shake. She'd stood in operating theaters while explosions hit the walls around her. She could stand in this climate-controlled office and listen to a woman read the script Kellerman had written. You performed invasive procedures without authorization. You possessed a blade in a public park. You operated beyond your stated qualifications. Chen looked up from her legal pad. We appreciate your intentions, but the city simply cannot accept this level of risk. Kellerman's expression was professionally sympathetic. Perfectly rehearsed. What if you'd punctured his heart? His family could own this department. He slid the termination letter across the desk like it weighed nothing. Effective immediately. Security will escort you to collect your belongings. Elena read the letter. Every phrase was carefully crafted. Every accusation technically defensible. No smoking gun. No overstated claims that could be countered. Just the methodical dismantling of someone who'd refused to play his game. She signed without expression and stood. The security escort came immediately, 2 officers who walked her through the morning sunlight while joggers paused and stared. The medical station was empty except for her. Elena opened her desk drawer and began placing items into a cardboard box. The cracked World's Okayest nurse mug her nephew had given her 2 years ago. The half-dead succulent she'd kept alive on the windowsill for 8 months, the tiny act of defiance against the sterile corporate environment, the one thing Kellerman had mocked during that city council inspection. And then the photograph. Sergeant Rachel Okonkwo. 2008, Ramadi. Intelligence officer assigned to Elena's unit, the woman who'd moved through dusty streets with the grace of someone who understood that hesitation was a luxury they couldn't afford. Rachel, who'd taken shrapnel meant for a squad of Marines and had died in Elena's arms before the medevac arrived, before Elena could do anything except hold her hand and repeat her name over and over like it was a prayer that might change the impossible. The folded flag rested on top of the photograph, triangle folded, military precise, 13 folds for 13 colonies and all the symbolism that doesn't actually bring anyone back. Rain began as Elena walked to the Colfax Avenue bus stop. Not a drizzle. Real rain, the kind that hammered the pavement like accusation. She sat on the bench with the cardboard box in her lap, watching water soak through the edges, dripping onto the mug, onto the succulent's brown leaves, onto Rachel's photograph. The box disintegrated slowly. The mug cracked against her leg. Her phone buzzed at 9:08 p.m. A text from Collins, smuggling investigation reassigned. Thank you for your service. 8 months of watching. 8 months of swallowing mockery while Kellerman poisoned her name in meetings, while he told people she'd falsified her credentials, while he positioned himself as the reasonable voice of authority protecting the city from a dangerous fraud. 8 months of documenting his brother-in-law's overpriced contracts that funneled dirty money through the municipal system, documentation she'd compiled in reports that nobody would read now because her cover was blown and the investigation belonged to another team. Elena's hands finally shook. Not from cold. The rain soaked through her jacket, but it wasn't the rain. It was 8 months of silence. 8 months of maintaining a composure that now meant nothing. It was Rachel, who'd never gotten to shake or cry or sit on a bench in the rain because she'd given everything, and Elena had survived to investigate 3 years of classified paperwork that had led her to this park, this mission, this rain-soaked bus stop where a cardboard box fell apart in her lap and nobody noticed. A bus passed. She didn't signal. Another bus came and went. Elena sat holding the disintegrating remains of her cover, her position, her carefully constructed identity as just a nurse, just another Parks Department employee that nobody had reason to notice or respect. The rain fell harder. The succulent's pot shattered. Rachel's photograph floated in the cardboard debris. For days after her firing, the Parks Department convened a public thank you ceremony in the community center auditorium, Thomas Kellerman's orchestrated opportunity to demonstrate crisis management, to position himself as the steady hand guiding Denver parks through turbulent waters. Commissioner Dorothy Chen sat in the front row, her expression neutral. The auditorium held maybe 200 people, parks board members, vendors, maintenance staff, city council representatives, and the usual collection of civic-minded residents who showed up for anything involving gratitude and refreshments. Kellerman stood at the podium, already sweating through his collar at 8 in the morning, already reaching for his water glass with fingers that weren't quite steady. He had invited the vendor Elena saved at the farmer's market, the man with the penetrating chest wound, the vendor everyone knew had miraculous luck to be alive. What Kellerman didn't know was who that vendor actually was. The man's name was Farik Al-Sharif, though the Parks Department files listed him as Frank Sharp, a simple produce distributor from Commerce City. What the files didn't disclose was that Frank Sharp had served as a low-level asset for military intelligence for the past 14 months, embedded in Denver's street-level smuggling network. He knew which vendors were moving contraband. He knew which routes went where. He knew everything. And when Kellerman introduced him to the crowd as a testament to our Parks Department's commitment to safety and preparedness, Frank's dark eye scanned the auditorium and found her standing in the back beside the emergency exit, still in her civilian clothes, jeans and a grey hoodie, barely noticeable, exactly where she wanted to be. Elena didn't move. Elena never moved. She had learned long ago that stillness was its own form of power, that the quietest people in the room were often holding it all together while everyone else was falling apart. Frank began to speak, thanking the Parks Department, thanking emergency responders, his English heavily accented but clear. His gaze kept drifting to Elena. And then he said something that made Kellerman's jaw tighten, something he said in Arabic first, then repeated in English for the audience, Al-Malik al-Aqdar. The Green Angel. That is what we call her. The one who brought me back from death. The room shifted. A murmur rippled through the crowd. Kellerman's hand tightened on the microphone. Yes, well, the Parks Department medical station was equipped to handle, but he never finished. A man in the third row stood, his military bearing evident in the set of his shoulders, the trim of his beard. His name was Marcus Webb, Marine veteran, 15 years service, now sitting on the Parks board representing veteran interests. He was already pulling up his tablet, his fingers moving with the precision of someone who knew exactly what he was looking for. He found her citation. The military database was restricted, but the Parks Board had authorized access for background verification on city employees. One click. The screen illuminated. His voice carried across the auditorium like a rifle shot. Captain Elena Martinez. Combat Medical Badge, citation dated June 14, 2013. For field surgeries performed under direct fire in Ramadi. Bronze Star for heroism. The citation reads. He paused, his voice dropping to something that sounded like respect. Extraordinary heroism under enemy fire. Medical interventions that exceeded standard scope of practice and saved Allied lives during active combat operations. The silence was so absolute you could hear the fluorescent lights buzzing overhead. Kellerman's face had gone the color of old bone. Elena remained motionless in the back of the auditorium, her shoulders squared, her expression unchanged. But everyone could see it now, the way she stood, the way her hands rested at her sides, the way her eyes had shifted from calm to something else entirely. The timid nurse in the grey hoodie had vanished. In her place stood a woman who had held dying soldiers while bullets tore through canvas tents. The voice transformation had already begun. Then the general stood. It was impossible not to notice, a two-star general in full dress uniform doesn't blend into a crowd of Parks Department employees and civic volunteers. His name was General Marcus Hayes, commander of the Mountain Post's Medical Training Division, and he had come to the ceremony for entirely different reasons until he heard the name Martinez called aloud. He recognized it immediately. He had her service record memorized. He rose slowly, deliberately, and rendered a full military salute, fist to chest, arm extended, the kind of salute that was reserved for fallen soldiers and extraordinary service. He held it. The auditorium froze. Every veteran in the room stood and saluted without being asked. The motion was like dominoes falling, a Marine, Army, Air Force. Even Frank al-Sharif, though his salute was less practiced, rendered one anyway. Elena's jaw tightened. That was the only acknowledgement she gave. She didn't salute back. She didn't need to. The salute was one-directional. It was the room acknowledging something about her that had been invisible for 8 months. Kellerman lunged for the microphone. Not metaphorically. He actually dove across the podium, his hip knocking over the water glass, his voice suddenly pitched high and frantic. This is fraud. This is stolen valor. This woman is not a military officer. She's a park employee who falsified credentials. She endangered patients with unauthorized procedures. But the room had gone so quiet, so still, that every word echoed back to him like an indictment. Commissioner Chen was already moving, already signaling security. General Hayes's expression hadn't changed, but his hand had dropped from his salute, and his eyes were fixed on Kellerman with the kind of regard usually reserved for someone who had just stepped in dog waste. Webb was still holding up his tablet, the citation still glowing on the screen, irrefutable and permanent. That was when the back doors opened. The IT contractor from Cedar Creek Medical, a man named Marcus Webb, former Army sergeant, 2 tours in Afghanistan, entered the auditorium pushing a small cart with a laptop and projector. He wasn't alone. Behind him came Victoria Cross, Elena's military intelligence handler, dressed in a civilian pantsuit that probably cost more than Kellerman made in a month. She was carrying a folder. Webb began setting up without any preamble, without asking permission. He simply connected the laptop and brought an image up on the large screen behind the podium. It was security footage from the Parks Department medical station. Timestamp, 3:42 a.m., 3 days ago. The image showed Kellerman in the empty medical station, his hands on a keyboard, his administrator credentials glowing on the monitor. He was selecting files. Deleting them. Footage of Elena performing needle decompression on Colonel Reeves. Footage of her trauma surgery on Frank al-Sharif. Footage of Kellerman screaming at her to step back while she was trying to save a man's life. Delete. 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 The timestamp scrolled, 3:44 a.m. 3:11 a.m. 3:51 a.m. Each file removal recorded, each deletion flagged, each action creating a digital fingerprint that couldn't be erased because Webb had anticipated the attempted erasure. He had backed up the mirror. Everything was still there. "Sir," Webb said to Kellerman, his voice steady as concrete, "you attempted to destroy federal evidence. That's a felony. Tampering with recordings of medical procedures is a felony. Falsifying incident reports is a felony. Your brother-in-law's medical supply company, Ridge Medical Solutions, submitted fraudulent contracts to the city of Denver totaling $847,000 in overcharges." Webb clicked to the next image: spreadsheets, vendor payment records, delivery manifests that didn't match what was actually received. The city ordered 400 units of sterile gauze. Ridge delivered 160 units and billed for 400. The city ordered for solution. Ridge sent saline and billed for pharmaceutical-grade supplies. This is fraud. This is contraband routing. He looked at Commissioner Chen. This is why Captain Martinez was actually here. Military intelligence was investigating smuggling operations using municipal vendors as cover. Mr. Kellerman's brother-in-law wasn't just overcharging the city. He was moving contraband through Parks Department supply channels. The color drained from Kellerman's face so completely that for a moment Elena thought he might actually collapse. She briefly considered whether she should be the one to catch him. She decided against it. Decorum could manage itself. Federal investigators arrived at the Parks Department offices at 10:41 a.m. that same morning. They had warrants. They had subpoenas. They had the kind of authority that made city administrators step aside without argument. Kellerman's brother-in-law, a man named David Kellerman, was arrested in his office at 11:19 a.m., handcuffs ratcheting tight around his wrists, federal agents reading him his Miranda rights while his staff watched from their cubicles. His company, Ridge Medical Solutions, was seized. Its assets frozen. Its contracts with the city terminated. By noon, Kellerman had received a termination letter identical to the one he had given Elena, the same legal language, the same severance terms, the same formal acknowledgement that his services were no longer required. 6 months later, Elena stood in her reinstated office, and it was not the small medical station she had worked from before. It was a proper facility now, examination rooms with full emergency equipment, a medication dispensary with controlled substance safes, supplies that were actually accounted for and appropriately sourced. The sign outside the door read Captain Elena Martinez Memorial First Aid Station, named not after her but after Sergeant Rachel Okonkwo, her combat medic, the one who had died in Ramadi with a bullet in her chest and Elena's hands pressing against the wound. Rachel's photograph hung on Elena's office wall, young, smiling, alive, frozen at 24 years old. Beside it hung the folded flag from Rachel's casket, the triangle crisp and precise, the weight of it somehow heavier than fabric should be. Through her window, Elena watched a medical supply van pull into the loading dock. Ridge Medical Solutions was printed on the side, but the company had been restructured, new ownership, new management, federal oversight on every transaction. The driver opened the door. Thomas Kellerman climbed out, wearing a polo shirt with the company logo, his hair grayer than it had been 4 months ago, his movement slower. He carried boxes of gauze and antiseptic, signing the delivery manifest held by a parks maintenance worker who didn't recognize him. Elena didn't go outside to watch. She didn't need the satisfaction. The satisfaction was implicit in every box he carried, every supplier uniform he wore. Every morning he woke up knowing exactly what he had lost. Victoria Cross visited that afternoon, carrying a folder thick enough to require both hands. "The smuggling network is dismantled," she said, settling into the chair across from Elena's desk. 7 arrests. 3 vendors. 2 distributors. 1 federal conviction already finalized. Your work broke the entire operation open. Elena nodded, her hands folded on the desk in front of her. Rachel would have appreciated that, she said quietly. Cross slid the folder across the desk. New assignment. If you're interested. The folder was marked Newark Hospital Administration, Classified Pharmaceutical Oversight. Elena opened it, scanning the details, another undercover placement, another identity, another mission into the machinery of institutional corruption. Before she could respond, Commissioner Chen appeared at the office door with 3 members of the parks board and a presentation case. "Captain Martinez," Chen said formally, "the city of Denver owes you an apology and our gratitude." She opened the case. Inside was a bronze star, its ribbon crimson and white, its weight substantial and real. Elena looked at it for a long moment. "I'll need full hiring authority," she said quietly, her voice lower than it had been during the ceremony, more command level. "And direct access to all vendor contracts." Chen extended her hand. "Done." That evening, Elena sat on the Washington Park bench where Colonel Reeves had collapsed 8 months earlier, where she had begun CPR with her hands and her muscle memory and her absolute refusal to let another soldier die if she could stop it. A bronze plaque was mounted on the backrest now, in honor of Captain Elena Martinez and all who serve in silence. A jogger stopped, reading the plaque, then nodded respectfully to Elena before continuing his run. Elena touched the folded flag in her jacket pocket, the weight of it grounding her, reminding her of Rachel, reminding her of why she was still here instead of in some other city, some other assignment. She opened her phone and texted Collins, "Newark assignment accepted. Start date in 3 months." She stood, shouldering her medical bag, and walked through the park where she had spent 8 months being mocked and underestimated by a man who had never seen actual weakness because he had never met actual strength. A vendor waved. 2 parks maintenance workers saluted from across the lawn. Elena's face remained neutral, but her stride was steady, purposeful, the stride of someone who had nothing left to lose and therefore everything to give. At the park exit, she passed Kellerman loading his final box into the van, his hands trembling slightly as he reached for the next carton. She spoke just loudly enough for him to hear, her voice level and clear, "Power is not a title. Power is the ability to help." She didn't wait for a response. She didn't need one. The words hung in the air behind her as she walked toward the tree line, and she didn't look back once. Before we go on, thank you for watching. Please hit like, it really helps. Subscribe if you're new. And leave a comment letting us know you're here. We love hearing from you.